J.K. Rowling is our most successful living author. The Harry Potter series sold 450 million copies. Since it finished 5 years ago, her fans have been desperate to know what she would do next. The answer is this.
She knocked again, sooner than she would have done if she had not wanted to distract herself from her own thoughts, and this time a distant voice said, "I'm fucking coming." The door swung open to reveal a woman who appeared simultaneously childlike and ancient, dressed in a dirty pale blue t-shirt and a pair of men's pyjama bottoms. She was the same height as Kay, but shrunken. The bones of her face and sternum showed sharply through the thin white skin. Her hair, which was home-dyed, coarse and very red, looked like a wig on top of a skull. Her pupils were minuscule, and her chest virtually breastless. "Hello, are you Terry? I'm Kay Borden from Social Services. I'm covering for Matty Knox." There were silvery pockmarks all over the woman's fragile grey-white arms, and an angry red open sore on the inside of one forearm. A wide area of scar tissue on her right arm and lower neck gave the skin a shiny, plastic appearance. Kay had known an addict in London who had accidentally set fire to her house and realised too late what was happening. "Yeah, right," said Terry, after an overlong pause.
Jo, when I started reading this novel, I was, I have to say, incredibly shocked. It's full of sex, violence, swearing, drug addiction. What's going on?
Were you really shocked?
I was shocked because I thought you couldn't be further from Harry Potter. Were you trying to prove something here?
No, I wasn't trying to shock anyone. I'm a very lucky person. Harry Potter's success brought me freedom. I feel I don't have to publish again. We can pay our bills. This is what I wanted to write. Yes, it's different. It's contemporary. It's realistic, and I don't have the constraints of fantasy. By which I mean that there are places you just wouldn't go in fantasy. The genre imposes those limits, and sex would obviously be one of those limits. And for 2 years writing The Casual Vacancy, I kept saying to myself, it was a lovely position to be in. I kept thinking, no one knows what I'm doing. No one knows these characters, they're just in my head. This is a fantastic place to be. It's been so long since I'd had that private world. And I would think, I don't have to publish this if I don't want to.
The Casual Vacancy is set in an idyllic fictional town in the southwest of England. With its town square, cobbled streets and rolling river, picture-perfect Pagford seems to be middle-class heaven, apart from one thing. The Fields, a grim neighbouring council estate complete with drug dealers, prostitutes and troubled teenagers.
I'm interested in that kind of deprivation and the idea of what happens in this idyllic, on the surface place, what happens beneath the surface, and how many ugly attitudes are running beneath the surface.
And how the disadvantaged can live so close to the advantaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the disadvantaged is 16-year-old Crystal Whedon, the daughter of a heroin addict.
Her memories of St. Thomas's included the muttered comments made about her by little girls in her class, 1 or 2 of whom she had slapped. When Social Services had allowed her to go back to her mother, her uniform became so tight, short and grubby that letters were sent from school, and Nana, Kath and Terry had a big row. The other girls at school had not wanted her in their groups except for their rounders teams. She could still remember Lexi Mollison handing everyone in the class a little pink envelope containing a party invitation and walking past Crystal with, as Crystal remembered it, her nose in the air. Only a couple of people had asked her to parties. She wondered whether Fats or his mother remembered that she had once attended a birthday party at their house. The whole class had been invited, and Nana Kath had bought Crystal a party dress. So she knew that Fats's huge back garden had a pond and a swing and an apple tree. They had eaten jelly and had sack races. Tessa had told Crystal off because, trying desperately hard to win a plastic medal, she had pushed other children out of the way. One of them had had a nosebleed. If you were to distill the book into one line, it would be, what do we do about Crystal? Crystal is the kind of girl that I think a huge number of people would simply walk past and think, lout. She's a 16-year-old girl who is ignorant, promiscuous, intermittently violent. And the man who dies in the first 2 pages of the novel has managed to kindle a little bit of ambition and self-respect in her.
The dead man is Barry Fairbrother, a warm-hearted, socially progressive parish councillor. With his demise, the Fields lose their most vocal and influential champion.
Barry was born there, and Barry got out. Barry, through his own intelligence and a bit of luck, he managed to make his way out. And there's just something inspirational, I think, for Crystal in having contact with this man who is the living personification of an escape through education. So he leaves the casual vacancy, he leaves a vacuum into which a number of people swarm. So then the idea came to me of a council election, and that was a perfect way into a small community. It was a perfect way into the ideas that I really wanted to explore.
The Conservative councillors of Pagford are desperate to replace Barry with one of their own. If they succeed, they'll be able to change the town's boundary and reassign the troublesome council estate to the neighbouring city. It's not just an election, it's an opportunity.
There was nothing, as far as Howard could see, to stop the Fielders growing fresh vegetables, nothing to stop them disciplining their sinister, hooded, spray-painting offspring, nothing to stop them pulling themselves together as a community and tackling the dirt and the shabbiness, nothing to stop them cleaning themselves up and taking jobs, nothing at all. So Howard was forced to draw the conclusion that they were choosing, of their own free will, to live the way they lived, and that the estate's air of slightly threatening degradation was nothing more than a physical manifestation of ignorance and indolence. People in that condition tend to be treated as though they're like mould. It just happened. They just sprung up there. Well, something did happen. Something somewhere went wrong in that family. What was it? And sometimes that gives you clues.
But the answers are often more complex than
Always.
Politicians and social
Oh,
workers.
no, absolutely. Of course they are. I mean, I think that... Yes, and I think the novel shows that. There is no simple answer to the question, what do we do about Crystal? And that, I think, is sometimes why people lose patience and would rather see things in a very black and white way, and it's easier to stigmatise and sort of shunt these people out of sight and not engage, because it is complex and it can sometimes feel very hopeless.
How much do you think you're going into some kind of heart of social darkness here?
Heart of social darkness. I think that, well, to me, personally, I think it's a place we should go. And I think it's a little, it's cowardly too strong. I don't know, to me it seems the obvious place to go, you know, where people are desperate. Yes, I'm attracted to that as a subject, certainly.
How do you know about it all?
Well, I've known people like Crystal and indeed like Terry. I mean, I've had a peculiar life experience when it comes to social mobility, I suppose. I was born into a very ordinary middle-class family where there wasn't a great deal of money, but we weren't deprived in any way. I worked as a teacher, I worked for charities, didn't make a great deal, you don't make a great deal of money in that situation. Then I was for a few years very, very poor. I was living solely on benefits as a single mother. I have been as poor as it's possible to go without being homeless. And as we all know, I've become very rich. That was certainly a very unexpected turn of events, but I've known life at real extremes.
How much did that early experience make you sympathetic to the outsider, the ignored, the downtrodden?
I find it hard to say it strongly enough. I mean, the most powerful experience I had of being the outsider or of being the other was definitely of being very poor. We talk about the poor as this homogenous, faceless mass. That's how they are discussed. I mean, it's sometimes with the best intentions of the world, but one of the first things to go is often your individuality, that you are seen so differently. And I think if you've been there, you never forget that experience. I will never forget that experience. A weight was pressing on Crystal's lungs and her ears were ringing. Obbo must have given her mother not a single bag, but a bundle. The social worker had seen her blasted. Terry would test positive at Bellchapel next time, and they would chuck her out again. And without methadone, they would return to that nightmare place where Terry became feral, when she would again start opening her broken-toothed mouth for strangers' dicks so she could feed her veins. And Robbie would be taken away again, and this time he might not come back.
One of the central locations in the novel is a drug rehabilitation clinic, which is in danger of being closed down. And that is actually one of the battlegrounds of the novel, whether people think the undeserving poor are worth saving or not.
My husband worked for a while at an addiction clinic. My husband's a doctor. And I would say the thing that struck me most about him working there was how precarious its existence constantly was. It got funding from a number of different places, and there was always a sense of knife edge about it, about whether it would be able to limp on and how many people they would be able to employ and so on. And I'd never really understood how precarious that setup could be until he worked there. I'm looking at quite a lot of addictions in this novel. You have the middle-class heavy drinker. You have a woman who's sinking bottle of wine every time she uncorks a bottle or more. That's acceptable. You know, that's winked at. Everyone does that. No one thinks twice about her. We have a couple of people who are using food in the way that an addict uses an illicit substance to anaesthetise and to comfort. I'm interested in the moral weight, if you like, that we give to different kinds of addiction. I'm very interested in how much various addictions cost society in all kinds of ways.
You make a big parallel in the novel between the expense of that and the expense of a middle-class man's heart condition, for example.
For a long time, the novel, in my head, was called Responsible. That was my working title. Because a central theme, possibly the central theme, is responsibility. How much each of us, individually, is responsible for where we find ourselves in life, and then how responsible are we for other people's happiness, from your partner or your child, all the way up to society's ills, if you like.
I think it's a novel about hypocrisy as much as responsibility, so that the middle-class characters expect standards of behaviour that they don't necessarily display themselves, particularly towards their children. They have an incredibly, what one might call, old-fashioned attitude to their adolescent children, while shagging all over the place themselves.
Not everyone is shagging all over the place themselves. You're absolutely right about hypocrisy. A lot of people sit in judgment on the Whedon family. And it is right that the Whedon family is looked at, because there are issues galore within that family that need to be looked at. But some of the people doing the looking, their own family lives might not bear too much examination. I wouldn't trust Crystal Whedon to look after a boiling egg, said Miles, and Samantha laughed again. Oh, look, it's to her credit she loves her brother, but he isn't a cuddly toy. Yes, I know that, snapped Kay, remembering Robbie's shitty, crusted bottom, but he's still loved. Crystal bullied our daughter Lexi, said Samantha, so we've seen a different side of her to the one I'm sure she shows you. Look, we all know Crystal's had a rough deal, said Miles. Nobody's denying that. It's the drug-addled mother I've got an issue with. As a matter of fact, she's doing very well on the Bellchapel programme at the moment. But with her history, said Miles, it isn't rocket science, is it, to guess that she'll relapse? If you apply that rule across the board, you ought not to have a driving licence, because with your history, you're bound to drink and drive again.
In many ways, although this is very, very dark, it starts as a comedy, doesn't it? I mean, it is a kind of satire about contemporary Britain in
I don't know
ways.
I wouldn't call it satire, honestly. It is comic in places, but I don't really think it's a black comedy. I think it's a comic tragedy.
And is that how you
view life? Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I know an unusual cross-section of people, and I think people's lives generally are more absurd, sadder, funnier, stranger than your average soap opera would make it appear, actually. Or many books would make it appear.
Because you put.
But then, if you depict that, you're called a satirist. But I don't think I'm writing satire.
In one way, the disadvantaged, Crystal Whedon and her family, are described with great social realism, I think, and the middle-class people are described in quite a comic way sometimes. And I wonder whether that's entirely fair.
Well, clearly I'm middle class. I mean, I'm not in the I don't in the slightest believe that this is all the middle class's fault. Having said that, there are people like Howard who espouse exactly those attitudes and who talk in that way. I mean, I know this. I know that. I don't think that's satire. In fact, if anything, I think I've toned him down a bit.
Obviously, you have a left-of-centre position on this.
Yes. However, I can totally understand the attitude that says, oh God, don't let Crystal be in my child's class. But I do get angry when I hear people talk and I think, can you not engage your imagination to the tiniest degree so that you understand what it might be like not to be you? And I don't just mean imagining what it would be like to be homeless or imagining what it would be like to have to live on benefits, though some people would benefit from knowing what that felt like. But even to the small degree that some people fail to appreciate that not everyone has their life experience. You know, just try and imagine. I find that frustrating. There are few people who are truly capable of thinking outside their own personal experience.
Which is the novelist's job.
It is the novelist's job, and if the novelist is worth their salt, they will be able to think themselves into all sorts of people's experience, yeah. It doesn't necessarily make them a better person, but that is the job.
Shirley's eyes were fixed respectfully on her knees, and her hands were clasped, apparently in prayer, but she was really mulling over Howard and Parminder's little exchange about the sari. Shirley belonged to a section of Pagford that quietly lamented the fact that the old vicarage, which had been built long ago to house a high church vicar with mutton chop whiskers and a starch aproned staff, was now home to a family of Hindus. Shirley had never quite grasped what religion the Jwandas were. She thought that if she and Howard went to the temple or the mosque or wherever it was the Jwandas worshipped, they would doubtless be required to cover their heads and remove their shoes and who knew what else, otherwise there would be outcry. Yet it was acceptable for Parminder to flaunt her sari in church. It was not as though Parminder did not have normal clothes, for she wore them to work every day. The double standard of it all was what rankled, not a thought for the disrespect it showed to their religion, and, by extension, to Barry Fairbrother himself, of whom she was supposed to have been so fond.
I think there's a wonderful irony in the book that there's lots of scenes set around and in the church.
And no one ever goes there. Yeah, I like that too.
In fact, the dominant religion of the book is Sikhism.
Yeah, well...
Why? What attracts you to Sikhism?
Oh, it's egalitarianism. It's an amazing religion. My interest was sparked years and years and years ago when I was in my 20s. And a girl I worked with briefly, who was from a Sikh family, and we only ever had one serious conversation on the subject, but it stuck with me. It's always stuck with me. She told me about the fact that men and women are explicitly described as equal in the Holy Book, and that women are not excluded from any part of religious rites or observance. Oh my God, really? I wanted to have a family of colour in Pagford. The Jwandas are they're archetypal middle-class family, a two-doctor family, three attractive children, and they bring out a lot of feelings in the people around them. Pagford is a very white place. I grew up in a very white place. And that was an interesting way to examine, well, certain attitudes within Pagford. And clearly, in a novel that's about exclusion and prejudice and outsider status and division, well, they had to be Sikhs, didn't they? They had to be Sikhs.
Slowly, very slowly, her family seemed to be putting themselves to bed at last. Jaswant spent a long time in the bathroom, clinking and crashing around. Sukhvinder waited until Jas had finished primping herself, until her parents had stopped talking in their room, for the house to fall silent. Then, at last, it was safe. She sat up and pulled the razor blade out from a hole in the ear of her old cuddly rabbit. She had stolen the blade from Vikram's store in the bathroom cabinet.
She got off the bed and groped for the torch on her shelf and a handful of tissues, then moved into the furthest part of her room, into the little round turret in the corner. Here, she knew, the torch's light would be confined and would not show around the edges of the door. She sat down with her back against the wall, pushed up the sleeve of her nightshirt and examined by torchlight the marks left by her last session, still visible, crisscrossed and dark on her arm, but healing. With a slight shiver of fear that was a blessed relief in its narrow, immediate focus, she placed the blade halfway up her forearm and sliced into her own flesh.
The daughter in this Sikh family does something that I think every parent of a teenage girl is terrified of, which is self-harm.
Yes.
Why?
The casual vacancy for me means lots of different things. One of the things it means is the emptiness that nearly everyone carries in them. And every single character in this book is seeking to fill an emptiness, a lack in their life. Sukhvinder is trying to, clearly it's an act of expiation, it's a way of releasing pain.
What attracts you to writing about adolescence?
Teenagers can be incredibly fragile, are almost always very fragile actually. But I don't think I sentimentalise teenagers. I mean, a couple of them are real little bastards as well in this book, you know, and some of their behaviour is atrocious. But they also occasionally light on real profundities and truths that some of the adults aren't that interested in getting out or would prefer to ignore. So they are this, as I think teenagers are, this curious mixture of truth-teller and seeker and obtuse and sometimes very destructive force.
Draco, years ago, I knew a boy who made all the wrong choices. Please let me help you.
I don't want your help. Don't you understand? I have to do this. I have to kill you. He's gonna kill me.
This is a radically different book, but there are sort of echoes of the themes from Harry Potter.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's true. It's like your DNA. You can't. I don't think a writer can disguise their DNA, if you will. So probably everything I write will ultimately be about death and morality. You know, I'll probably never be able to, because that's what I think about. That's what consumes and obsesses me. Those are the things I think about all the time.
Why are you so obsessed with those themes?
Mortality, I suppose. I was very young when my mother was diagnosed with an illness that she was unlucky enough to get in a very severe form. It's not always that severe, but with my mother it was. So I suppose from a relatively early age, I was very conscious of mortality. It wasn't just my mother. My sister and I were born into quite an old family, not in the sense of noble, but in the sense of aged. We were the only people in our generation, and funerals happened quite a lot in our youth. So I suppose that probably the death thing comes from there. If I'm honest, morality, I don't really understand why everyone isn't completely obsessed with morality, but they're not. I know that for a fact. But I am.
But do you see yourself as a moral writer?
Well, I think I am, but my books have been burned and I've had death threats, so apparently some people don't. I think I'm a pretty moral writer.
Can you remember when you first became aware that society wasn't perhaps as just as it should be?
Oh, I was really young. I mean, I was really young. I mean, well, I went to a comprehensive school where I was, I can remember all kinds of things going on, and people were clearly from families who were very different from mine, and coping with things at home that not many of us have had to cope with.
Did it make you want to change things?
Yeah. Yes, but this wasn't written as a political polemic. This is I think, a very character-driven novel.
Although you say this isn't a political novel, it is Political.
Well, it's political in the broadest sense, isn't it? I mean, in the final analysis, virtually everything is political. So what I mean is that I do not think there are black and white answers here, and I don't think that any single political party has the monopoly on the solution to these problems.
Barry Fairbrother got out of his council estate upbringing in the fields. He had social mobility, as it were.
Yep.
Do you think there's less social mobility for people who are Barry's teenage age now? I
mean, I fear for teenagers now in that situation, definitely. Statistics show that social mobility has slowed a lot in the last decade or so, which is incredibly depressing. Yeah, it's incredibly depressing, and I shudder to think what will happen to teenagers born into that kind of situation or living in that kind of situation right now, what their future will hold, because it does seem that the poverty trap is shut just as tightly as ever it was.
Would you say this is a novel more about broken people than broken Britain?
Definitely, definitely. I hate the phrase broken Britain. I think it's trite, simplistic, and it's about you know, political point scoring and talking points, and it's the kind of thing I loathe. And I think it's that kind of sloganeering is the antithesis, I think, of what needs to happen. We need to acknowledge the complexity of these situations, but unfortunately, democracy being the beauty parade it is, everything gets reduced to very black and white. Yeah, I suppose slogans often. And Broken Britain, I feel, was one of those.
In this book, it seems that there are people, some of whom have more choices than others.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. How much do we blame Crystal for how she behaves? And people will, I know, you know, quite a few people have now read the book and people have very different views on that, which is good, which is what I want. But I think I would go so far as to say I don't think I've got anything to say to a person who doesn't want to save Crystal Whedon, put it that way. So if someone reads the book and just can't really see the point in that, then I literally don't think I have anything to say to that person. They probably would have nothing to say to me.
How will you react if people hate it?
Well, if people hate it, then I will suck that up, as my teenage daughter would say. Any writer would rather people liked it, or enjoyed it, or got something worthwhile from it. You know, absolutely be lying if I said, oh, no, I don't care. Of course I care. But I had the most amazing experience with Harry Potter. It was very, very popular, and people loved the books, and, you know, that will stay with me forever. It was wonderful. I think some people will like it, and some people won't. I'm sure of that.
It's published tomorrow.
Yes.
I think that you may be in for a very bumpy ride.
Well, if I am, I am. I mean, hindsight's a funny thing. You know what? There were bumpy times with Harry too. And I'm a very fortunate woman, and if I am in for a bumpy ride, that's not the worst thing that can happen to me.
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.